Well, here we are at episode 13. Who'd have thought? Jude has only got three 13-year-olds downstairs, and two of those are unopened. So this week we're going to have another whiskey with the Royal Warrant. This one is Royal Brackla. It's an independent bottling by Duncan Taylor, aged 13 years in oak casks. And I've just had a bit of a taste of it. It's beautifully balanced, very sweet. Quite a lovely drop. So from Highland Distillery, Royal Brackla. So this August edition of Scientific American arrived just today, and I haven't had a chance to read it fully, but I just love the cover. How We Conquered the Planet. More like how we made a god-awful mess of the planet, perhaps. But our species apparently wielded the ultimate weapon, which was cooperation. And let's have a think about, what we've learnt. And when I say what we've learnt, I mean what humanity has learnt, not what we've learnt necessarily over the course of these series of talks. So the first thing we've learned, of course, is that nothing is real. John Lennon actually observed that, although he didn't really understand the technology of how it is that nothing can actually be real. In fact, it's all just an illusion. But the other important thing that we've picked up on is that God is not a bearded man in the sky, just as we can not imagine someone with the meager intelligence of you or I ever running the world, let alone the universe. We can get our heads around the idea of a supercomputer the size of the universe. That's how big the superposition is. It contains everything that's in the universe. We can imagine a supercomputer of that size having the intelligence that we traditionally associate with God. And we now have a bit of an understanding as to how that would work. So along with those two things, we can now sort of start thinking about how we're going to actually utilize that super intelligence. And we've come across a lot of the implementation of a lot of technology lately. And Andrew Keen has written a book entitled "The Internet is Not the Answer." We all know Jesus is the answer. Okay, but basically in this book he bemoans the people who, the internet, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Instagrams of the world, who have made an incredible amount of money employing basically a skeletal staff, but who have basically the capital and the turnover of large, now almost defunct companies like Eastman Kodak, which had a whole town of Rochester basically existed, 30,000 employees of Eastman Kodak, with I don't know, it was $30 billion in terms of the company capital. And this is the sort of money we're talking about with some of these companies like Instagram. But they have 5 employees. And the problem we face is that you all know how the internet works. These people are basically scalpers. They basically have sort of graft and corruption. They make you pay money, protection money, in order to get your product listed higher up on the hit list of Google, so that more people see your product and they go and they buy from you and not from someone else. And the more money you pay, the more you get ranked, and the more you sell product and put the small person out of business. And the Americans love this stuff. I mean, they're fed it in their mother's milk. They think it's all okay that we have a system that's basically fairly useful for making obscene amounts of money, and these obscene amounts of money are very useful. I mean, with the sort of amount of money that the guys at Google have made, we've had Google, we've had Google Maps, we've got the Google car, We've got GoPro. We've got some amazing technologies. We've got we've got Uber starting now, which is a fantastic idea. It's putting taxi companies out of business, but we're looking at a whole lot of emerging ways of conducting business, but we have to somehow reset this whole economy so that everyone gets a fair go, because ultimately on Google you've got products and ostensibly services, and you've got people in the world like nurses and teachers who actually do real work. They actually do something for a living, as opposed to these people who just basically put a markup on the selling of those goods and services, which is what advertising does. So yeah, the people who actually do stuff, there are all those Chinamen making all those products that we all buy, and at least they're actually doing something with their hands and making something real in the world, rather than just making sort of nothing. But just this week we've had a Russian oligarch invest $100 million in the search for terrestrial intelligence, and that project's sponsored, of course, by Stephen Hawking. And it's sort of cute the way Paul Davies and Stephen and all these guys, sort of want to find out and want to talk to the aliens when they've got aliens already here. I mean, it's not your classic bug-eyed sort of monster, but a lot of people have over time sort of suggested that I might be living on another planet sometimes with some of the things I say. But anyway, that's just the nature of the beast. That's what we have to do. So this all sounds very revolutionary, and in fact it is. I mean, in the conclusion of the 1999 film Fight Club, a computer virus spreads out across the city, the commercial districts of all the cities in the world, and basically resets all the electronic debt of basically everyone in the world. And that has its basis in a concept that the Israelites have called the Jubilee, where every 50 years basically all the slaves are released from their imprisonment. Prisoners are released from imprisonment, slaves are emancipated, and all debt is wiped clear. And that's certainly something we want to do. But with revolution, you have to ask, well, okay, you and whose army? I mean, who's going to be the Red Guard? Who's going to come up and sort of start lining all these people up and saying, how about it? Hand over all you've got, your money, all your life. Well, this is how it works. I mean, and it's sort of time that we started just focusing on this on this very thing, because it helps us understand the Odyssey. So when just after the ascension, or what is purported to be an ascension, which has only been told in the Bible by Luke, at the end of Luke's Gospel, he says that Jesus went up to a mountain and ascended into heaven. He just leaves it at that. None of the other Gospel writers talk about it. And, we just have built a whole lot of iconography around this idea of, because traditionally, the Greek philosophers, Greek religion would think that heaven is somewhere in the spheres. It's a fairly natural human instinct to think that's where heaven is. That Jesus would ascend to that place, and so there you have Luke talking about that. But you then have an event called Pentecost, which comes about 10 days after the ascension. So 40 days after the resurrection, you have Jesus ascending into heaven. 10 days later, you have Pentecost, which is where the Holy Spirit comes. People start talking in tongues. That is, the whole world starts talking about this revolution that Jesus was talking about, but they all start talking about it in their own language. And you'll have a lot of Pentecostal churches in the world have people sort of just talking a whole lot of gobbledygook, whereas in fact the original meaning of to speak in tongues was to speak in different languages, so that there was this meeting in Jerusalem where all of the all of the disciples started talking to because there was a festival where people from all different parts of the country had come who spoke different languages, were all starting to speak the same language. But after Pentecost, basically Peter was appointed the leader of the church, and that's where St. Peter comes from. St. Peter's Basilica is named after St. Peter in Rome. The Catholic Church started. And so you have, St. Peter is basically the head of the Christian church in Jesus' absence, of course. And the early church, the first people who started forming a collective, coming together and saying let's become a church, were all basically bringing everything that they owned, everything they had. They would sort of bring to the table. They'd give it to Peter, and the wealth that they brought to the table was distributed evenly amongst the people. So it was a very collective, very sort of left-wing sort of idea. And there was no compunction to do this. They just did it because they wanted to help the community out and help each other out, and the sort of sharing, loving community that was the idea that Jesus had. And a man and a wife, a couple, Ananias and Sapphira, had a little holiday home that they were keeping aside for their retirement, and they decided to sell this property and bring the proceeds to the church. But instead of bringing the whole lot, they decided they'd just keep half of it to themselves, just because they weren't quite sure how this Jesus Christianity thing was going to go. And so they brought what happened was they were in town, and Sapphira said she wanted to do a little bit more shopping, so she, with the half of the proceeds of the sale, they just sold the property, so she went and did a bit of shopping with the half of the proceeds that they kept, and Ananias took the other half and went to the meeting of the church and said to Peter, look, we've sold the house, the whole lot, here it is, and put it at the table, it's all for the church. And Peter had a little message from God, somehow the superposition said to Peter, here's a little, Ananias is not maybe telling the truth here. It's a sort of conscience thing that all of us experience from time to time. And he said to Ananias, is that the full amount that you've given there? Ananias said, straight up, just looked to Peter and said, yep, it's the total amount. And at that and Peter basically said, how is it that you think that you can lie to the Holy Spirit? Because in a sense, he was swearing before God that he had in fact brought the whole amount. He didn't have to bring the whole amount. He could have said, it's just half the amount. But what he did was he said, no, it's not half the amount, it's the full amount, which was basically deceiving or attempting to lie to the Holy Spirit. So when we talk about the Holy Spirit, we're talking about the superposition, the big supercomputer that's running the whole thing, and it knows absolutely every thought that we have in our heads. So there's no sort of escaping what the Holy Spirit knows. You can pretend to lie, but if you do, you run the risk of having what happened to Ananias at this point, which is that he basically fell down dead at the feet of Peter. Just stopped breathing, heart stopped, there he was, dead on the floor, and the other members of the church sort of picked him up and took him out and dug a hole and put him in it, buried him, and that was that. And so they got on with their business. But about an hour later, Sapphira turns up, says, how's it all going? How's Ananias? Did he give you the money? Are you all happy? Are you all pleased? Aren't we clever? We've sold this house and we've given it all to the church. And Peter said, how is it that you both conspired to deceive the Holy Spirit? Like you've just an hour ago, your husband did the same thing and he dropped dead and we took him out and buried him. So this is all in Luke's recounting of the early church called the Acts of the Apostles, which is basically his second volume after the Gospel of Luke comes the Acts of the Apostles. So in the early chapters, about chapter 5 of the Acts of the Apostles. How can you do this, Sapphira? And at that point, Sapphira drops down dead. Well, actually, Peter says, we've just buried your husband, and you're not far off. And sure enough, she just drops down dead. Heart stops. They pick her up. They go, and they hadn't covered up the hole actually, so they just put her in it, and then they covered up the two of them, one on top of the other, and that was the end of Ananias and Sapphira. So there's a sort of, it's always been very troubling, this story to Christians, because they don't know what to make of this incredibly judgmental God, who has given this example of how, and this is where the term comes, but by the grace of God go I. So every one of us in the world, in fact, are just teetering on the edge of whether we exist, and whether God's grace allows us to stay alive, or whether at any point He might decide to just resume our lease on life and say, no more. You've made a mess of the place, or you've done something wrong. We're just going to switch you off. And this can be quite a concern, and in fact, it impinges on the whole idea of theodicy, because if it were the case in what we call the age of grace, which is what we're living in at the moment, that if every time we made a mistake or did something wrong, our Father would punish us and reprimand us, if we rather than try and talk through it or be merciful, if every time someone went to, say, in the case of Cain and Abel, to murder his brother, so Cain came along, he didn't like the way God was showing Abel favour, so he went and killed Abel. If every time Cain, that instance of Cain coming to kill his brother, if Cain were to drop dead because the Holy Spirit or the superposition or the big computer running the whole show would enact a case of judgment and say, okay, we're going to turn Cain off and just make him drop dead before he actually has a chance to take Abel out, then we would all, particularly as monkeys just evolving out of the jungle, we would all form a very different opinion about how the world works. We would very soon be very unable to actually do anything and just get frozen in a stasis, because every time we try to venture out, as a child does, to try something new, maybe do something that's going to be harmful, it may be something that's going to be beneficial. It's all about innovation and about discovering and exploring the world, that children branch out and do things that maybe as adults we know they shouldn't do, but nevertheless, if every time an adult, but in an earlier world, as humanity's evolving, were to go out and go and try and kill his brother, a bit like 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the monkeys have a they've got the bone and sort of starts banging on the ground and starts killing his brother, which is of course a reenactment of the Cain and Abel story. If you've ever seen that famous opening scene from 2001, the Kubrick film, if the aggressor were to actually drop dead, the world would have evolved in a very, very different way, and importantly, it wouldn't have evolved. We wouldn't have got to the point where we are at the moment, and so this is why we have this period that we're living in, which is known in Christian circles as the Age of Grace. So up until the resurrection or the Day of Judgment, or the end of the world, whatever you want to call it, basically we're allowed to believe we can get away with things, which is, everyone knows that. We basically, every one of us has been deceitful at some stage. We've known we've got away with things. We've held back on telling the truth. All sorts of things we've done which we've got away with.